Thanks, Rosa. I'm going to introduce our second keynote speaker, who hopefully you all know. I think you would. It's ADBI-Yanagizawa, which I think I said that correctly for the first time ever. Drott, who is at the University of Zurich. He's been there since 2016 as a professor of development and emerging markets there. He's also an affiliated professor at the UBS Center for Economics in Society and the director of the Larson Rosenquist Foundation Center for Economics of Breastfeeding. Before joining Zurich, he was an associate professor of public policy at Harvard at the Kennedy School, and he did his PhD in economics at Stockholm University. He has many other interesting things in his bio. I think in the essence of time, I'm going to pass it over to him. The thing is, I think you're the tallest economist I know, but maybe that's networks are too small. I don't. All
right, cool. Thanks. It's great to be here. Super nice to see so many people doing cool stuff in this space. Today I'm going to talk about a simple question, how are gender norms perceived? And I want to spend the next 40 minutes or so first arguing why we should care about this question. I'll share a little bit of my own intellectual journey, sort of starting 7 years ago when I was at the Kennedy School. Where Rohini was my one of my mentors. At this point, I'm pretty much obsessed with this type of question, and hopefully I'll get you started potentially on the same kind of journey today if you're not already there. So I'll motivate it. Well, I think it's important to know the answer to this question, but then perhaps more interestingly, I'm going to show you new evidence that provides, I think, a pretty big jump in terms of understanding the answer to the question. Let me say that I'll build upon two papers with co-authors. So it's both of the papers are with Leah Bershin. It's at University of Chicago. The first paper is also with Alessandra Gonzalez, who's also at University of Chicago. She's a sociologist. And then the second paper is with Alexander Cappelen and Bertil Tungodden in Bergen, Norway, and Alessandro Buena at Stanford. This second paper is not publicly available yet, but for those of you interested, you can access it through this QR code. All right, so let's get started. Let me just start with a pretty obvious thing here that this doesn't work. Wait, what's going on? Oh, okay, there you go. All right, so just, a fact that everybody in this room is well aware of, which is that basically anywhere in the world you look at today, we're not near gender equality on major economic outcomes, right? So we've talked about female labor force participation. We talked about working outside of the home in market work. And so if you look at some parts of the world, say, Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, that's at the bottom of the spectrum in terms of these outcomes. We see huge gaps. They're not just huge gaps in the market space, but even in the legal space, right? So there's a World Bank report a few years ago, sort of documenting very clearly economic barriers just on the legal side. And in the 178 countries they investigated, in 155 of them, they could identify at least one law that put women on an unequal footing compared to men. Now, but you don't have to go to these kinds of countries, obviously, to find big gaps in outcomes. Even in the type of countries where a lot of these legal barriers have been solved, so I come from Sweden, for example, there's still major gaps in outcomes, not least when you look at, say, representation in top segments of firms. So, that's something we've talked about, or universities for that matter, something we've talked about over the last couple of days, including this leaky pipeline notion, right? And so you can see sort of in news media, it's an active debate in these countries, sort of how to promote women into leadership positions, right? Okay, so that's kind of the problem. This is what we all care about. Now, if you think about the policy toolbox that we have access to, or policymakers have access to, I think to simplify it, the way I think about it is there are basically three buckets. So the first bucket is changing laws and incentives. Okay, so let's take one simple example from Saudi Arabia, or actually they changed the law now. So let's say in 18 other countries in the world currently, for a woman to work outside of the home in a firm, they need written approval by a husband, right? So an obvious thing in theory that policymakers could do is remove that law, right? At the margin, that should help. So that's a kind of law. In more, say, gender equal countries, you could think of, say, quotas for women in boards, for example, like you have in Norway, right? That's changing the law. But just more broadly, those are interventions that change the economic incentives for firms or households in the market, right? And you don't necessarily need to change the laws as such, but you can provide various subsidies, such as subsidizing childcare and other things related to tax incentives. Okay, so that's one bucket, and there's very good reasons to think that that could change outcomes. One thing I should mention, though, is there are a couple of, let's say, call them problems or challenges with that, which is one, political economy. So laws would typically reflect the norms that exist in society. And by norms, I mean sort of the values, the preferences, the attitudes exist. They are pretty hard and persistent over time, we've seen in the data, right? So laws reflect partly norms. So in this kind of policy debate, and we've seen this over the last couple of days, you often end up in some space where you start talking about, well, the norms is more of the root problem. So can we try to change those norms, right? So we know they're slow moving, but we also know historical examples when norms can change quickly, first of all. They do change. This point was brought up yesterday in the policy roundtable. And we also know scientific evidence that you can change norms. You can change values and attitudes. Here's just one example by Seema Jayachandran and co-authors, shown through an experiment that targeting children in 10th grade in India, just discussing gender issues changed values and attitudes, right? So that's one example. Social psychology would also say that, or psychology more broadly, neuroscience, that the brain is plastic in early age. So, you can really change in the long run values like that. But there are other studies showing even among adults, you can change attitudes and behavior. This is partly shown in series of papers looking into the power of mass media and edutainment. So when cable news was rolled out in India, for example, there's a well-known paper by Emily Oster and Rob Jensen showing how gender attitudes and gender norms changed. There's work by Eliana Ferrara, for example, showing in Brazil that edutainment intervention changed norms. So it is possible, certainly. And I know Rohini has also worked in this space, looking at changing norms. And she talked about that yesterday. Okay, so that's the kind of I think the toolbox, but I think it's fine. But I want to propose adding a third dimension to the toolbox. Let me exemplify that with kind of what I mentioned before, how I've been thinking about this over the last few years. So when I was at Harvard, Rohini and Asim Khwaja, who was another professor at Harvard Kennedy School, started a collaboration with Ministry of Labor in Saudi Arabia. And Ministry of Labor in Saudi Arabia wanted more women. They wanted to reduce gender gaps in the labor market and get more women to work outside of the home. And we set up this, or I didn't do it, I was a little bit more junior at the time, but Rohini and Asim set up this collaboration with Ministry of Labor. And we had this conference, a couple of weekends, where we got kind of one of the best economists, a few of the best economists around the world, together with policymakers, and then try to brainstorm what kinds of interventions and also research that can be done to figure out how to move women into the labor market. And I was sitting and listening to the debate or the discussions, which was super fascinating, but they really were mostly in this space, right? So one of the things, for example, was, all right, women are not allowed to drive in this country. That seems really horrible if we want them to work outside of the home. Can we change the law? Well, political economy says, or that was challenging. What about finding another solution where we don't change the law, but maybe subsidize sort of in some way transportation, right? So that's one concrete example. Another one was there's no childcare in the country. So for mothers with children, maybe we should invest in subsidizing childcare, right? So that's very much in this bucket. This was discussed a little bit, but mostly I would say, and here's my recollection, was basically it wasn't addressed much. We basically view this as, look, norms are fixed, cultures are very conservative, and they kept hammering this to us, we economists. The policymaker kept saying, look, you have to be aware of that Saudi Arabia is a very, very conservative country when it comes to norms. Okay. So basically the way to think about this in the policy space is the more restrictive or conservative the norm is, the stronger you need the incentive to be to overcome and counteract, right? So that's, I think, is traditional classic economics at work. Now, I was sitting listening to those conversations, and I thought about another idea, which really comes from social psychology. It's an old idea, decades old, which is to say that if you think about how norms actually, why they matter, is because people want to take socially acceptable actions, and they're afraid of taking actions that they will be ostracized for in social context, right? So once you start thinking about that and apply it to, say, Saudi Arabia, you should at least ask the question, well, who is making these decisions? Well, anecdotal evidence says that husbands have a lot of decision-making power to get their wives to work, all right? Now, what's going through their optimization problem? Well, they do take these things into account, the loss incentives, but they have a perception about what the norm is, what's socially acceptable in the country. How do we know that they actually know what the norm is? Do we know that they have the correct perception? So the first question was that we thought from a scientific point of view, let's go to one of the most conservative countries in the world that has one of the biggest gaps to see if men understand what other men's views are, their attitudes. So in particular, should women be allowed to work outside of the home? Now, what did we find in the study? And this is the one with Leo Bursin and Alessandra Gonzalez. We found what I would call very high rates of support. So more than 80% of men said, yes, women should be allowed to work outside of the home. And we went very carefully methodologically to try to get to the right number there. I won't get into the kind of measurement details today, but if you want to measure these kinds of things, there's a number of things you should be concerned about regarding what's called surveyor bias or surveyor experimental demand effect, that people won't tell you the truth. But anyways, we found very high support, but then we asked people, a second question is, what do you think others what do you think people report? Or what do you think other men, in this case, believe in? Even men in neighborhoods. So we did this in various ways. It's a series of surveys and 2 experiments, but we found the big wedge. So people underestimate quite greatly how progressive, if I can use that word, other men are. So vast majority are totally fine on a personal level with women working outside of home, but they think other men are against it, or many more men that are actually against it. All right, once you come to that point, now the policy toolbox opens up, because now there's scope for an intervention, which is just about informing people about the actual norm, because people misperceive their own culture. People actually don't understand their own norms in their own country. So then that could, in theory, lead to very quick behavioral change within days or months, right? Rather than years. And this is what this paper documented as a proof of concept. All right, and it was published in 2020 in American Economic Review, so it's available to be read. Now, since then, we've thought about, well, did we detect something general, or was this some peculiar thing about Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi Arabia is peculiar in many ways, right? So now the next phase was to go and measure around the world how well people understand their own social norms in their countries. Okay. So that's the second paper with Alessandra Buena, Bertil Tungodden, and Alexander Kappen. Now we had to decide, all right, what do we want to measure? So we went to 60 countries who worked with Gallup. So we decided, and now we're spanning the entire global spectrum of gender equality, right? So now we have to measure things that are relevant for places like India and Pakistan and Philippines, as well as in Norway or the US or the Netherlands, right? So, so we thought, well, let's continue along this sort of what we did in Saudi Arabia and say, which deals with basic rights, okay? Should women be allowed to work outside of the home? So let's see if we can find other places where there is a gap. How many of those places exist in the world? The more of those places we exist, the policy toolbox opens up, because now you can think about a very cheap information intervention that potentially has big behavioral impact. But then we thought, well, in places like Sweden or Norway or the US, it's not really a policy debate anymore whether women should have equal rights as men. Much more the policy debate seems to be around other issues, one of which is the lack of women in leadership positions, either within firms or within the government. So that was the second dimension we went for. This is not to say that this is not a relevant question in developing countries or low-income countries. It is a relevant question. But we think in the high-income countries or the high gender equality countries, this question is not so relevant anymore in the debate. So it's a very simple paper, how norms perceive and how much potential is there for change, right? It's going to boil down to, at the end of the day, and you'll see this, 4 stylized facts about misperceptions. And a little bit to cut to the chase, there's going to be vast misperceptions around the world, which, if you believe the paper, means there's also quite great potential for change quickly. Then once we've gone through this, I'm going to try to dig a little bit deeper into understanding where do misperceptions come from? Why do we see this phenomenon, right? We think that's, as a social scientist, you always want to go deeper and deeper and deeper and really try to understand on a deep level. So I think we're making some progress here as well, which I hope you will find interesting. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about this new data that we collected and then show you some of these patterns. So I'll start with the actual norm, so what people's attitudes actually are. And then I'm going to show you by men and by women, and then get into misperceptions. So the main contribution is this part, misperceptions. This is also a little bit of a call to social science or not just economics, but beyond that. There's been a lot of surveys around the world over decades, one of the most prominent one being World Value Survey, that measures norms, but they measure the actual norms, never perceptions. So we are the first, to my knowledge, to use representative surveys at the national level to get both at the same time, and then so we can compare. Okay, and that's going to boil down to 4 stylized facts. Then, if we have time, I'll talk a little bit more about the understanding these patterns on a sort of mechanism level, and then I'm going to conclude. Okay, so the data set. So we go to 60 countries. We work with Gallup. Gallup is probably the best company, at least we have identified, that can do national representative surveys at a high quality around the world. So we have about 1,000 observations in each country. Some of the larger countries, there's a little bit more, but we have about 66,000 individuals surveyed. And you can see it's all continents of the world, spanning the global spectrum of gender inequality. In terms of coverage, we cover 85% of the world population and 90% of global GDP. Specifically, it's representative of the resident population age 15 and older in a number of key dimensions. Here's to see how it's representative across the gender inequality spectrum. So here we're lining up the UN Gender Inequality Index. We have inverted it, so the 100 means the most gender equal countries in the world. So here you see the Scandinavias, and here you see the least gender equal countries in the world. In this paper, for simplicity, because there's just so much data, we're going to just split them into terciles. There's going to be 20 countries in each tercile. And so more specifically, what exactly are we eliciting? What's the survey question? So for basic rights, it's the following. Please tell me whether you agree or disagree with the following statement. Women should have the freedom to work outside of the home. So this is replicating essentially the Saudi Arabia question. And then affirmative action, we label it affirmative action. Maybe we can debate the semantics of what it actually means, but specifically we ask, the government and companies should give priority to women when hiring for leadership positions. Okay. This seems to be a very relevant policy debate in a lot of countries. Okay, now perceptions, then we tell people, we will ask the previous question to 100 random and then women or men in and then whatever country we're in. If you had to guess how many of the, and if it's about women, it's women, will say that they agree with the following statement. Note here, we have two versions cross-randomized across individuals. One version says, what will they report? And what will they truly think? Okay. This is a methodological trick to get at this surveyor demand bias. So maybe they will misreport. There are various ways to deal with this, and we go through a series of validation steps in the paper. This is one of them. If there's no surveyor, if the people don't misreport to the surveyor, we should find very similar patterns regardless of this version and that version, and that's what we find. But we do a number of other things. So we do what's called a randomized response technique, where you have more cover or a plausible deniability. We also try incentivized versus non-incentivized. Second order beliefs doesn't matter. Randomized response technique doesn't matter. So we'll do a few things. But anyways, this is what I call the second order beliefs, the perception. And we do that for both basic rights and affirmative action. Right. So we have two questions, but we also ask specifically by gender. And this I haven't seen work on before as well. Okay, so just a few definitions. So I'm going to say support for a policy, basic rights or affirmative action, is at the individual level, you're either for or against. Okay. The actual gender norm, when I say that, I mean the share supporting the policy in a country, right? Is it 60%? Is it 40%? Is it 90%? Actual gender differences in the countries, the difference in the share of females supporting the policy versus males. Okay? So that's a gap. So in this sense, you can think of this as capturing conflict across the genders on this policy issue. Is there a lot of tension across the genders, or is there not so much tension? Okay, the perception of support for a policy is measured as, the individuals from each country state their perception, and what's that share, right? So do people think it's 60% on average, or do people think it's 80% on average in a country? Okay. So then there are two key concepts here. You can overestimate, so you can have misperception where you think support is greater than it actually is, or you can underestimate it. In Saudi Arabia, we found underestimation in support among men. So, there was over 80% actual support, but 75% underestimated that. And then you can break it down by gender. All right, so let's get into the actual global patterns. And I'll start with a map, or two maps actually. So here, this is color coded so that more blue means higher support. And here's basic rights, and here's affirmative action. If you start with basic rights, what we found in Saudi Arabia, which is in this 80% plus range, that replicates in a lot of countries in the Middle East, but it replicates in a lot of countries around the world. So support on average is very, very high. For affirmative action, it's a much more nuanced picture. There's I think a global north versus a global south discrepancy or gap that's pretty big. So in the global south, it's actually very high support for this notion that firms and the government should prioritize women when hiring for leadership positions. The support is much less in the global north. Okay, let's break it down even further, country by country, and see in this a little bit more specifically. And here we're ordering up the countries according to the black dots here. So on the y-axis, you have basic rights, actual support, right? So this would be 100%, 0%, 50%. So above 50% means that a majority supports this policy. So in every country in the world, we see that a majority of the population supports it, even among men. So men is green, women is orange. We thought about doing this blue and pink, but we didn't want to lean into gender stereotypes. Okay, so green is men, orange is women. And that's going to be a color coding I'm going to use throughout the talk. Okay, so what are some of these countries? The most conservative countries, if you will, Pakistan, Indonesia, for example, support 60 to 70%. You see Iraq here, about 80%. Turkey, 88%. And then you have countries here that's basically at 95% or more above. I mean, it's the Scandinavian countries, the US, Italy, Argentina. Okay, that's basic, right? Affirmative action, same y-axis, but now the policy dimension is a different one. Here we see much more heterogeneity. So you see, here are all the countries for which the average support is a majority, but here you see in some about a fourth of the countries or so, only a minority supports it. Okay, so for example, down here to the right, you have Ethiopia, Kenya, Senegal, Vietnam, India, Thailand. Okay. Down here, you have Korea, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Netherlands, the US is here. Okay. So, and then you see the gender level as well. Note that both in this picture and in the previous picture, essentially everywhere, women are more in favor. So that seems to be a very general pattern across the world. The gap here, is on average in the ballpark of 15 percentage points, give or take. And here, in the upper space here, there's very little difference, but here there's quite a significant difference. Okay. All right. Now, this is just showing you the raw data. Let's try to break down the world into these 3 terciles, right? And this conference has been mostly about, I think, this tercile. So the types of countries around the world with very low levels of gender equality on observable dimensions. So the UN index is what we're using. It looks at the labor market. It also looks at political representation and also some health outcomes like maternal mortality. But none of these results that you will see today is specific to the UN index. We can use other indices and the same thing will pan out. All right, so showing you the overall support in the population here, that's the gray, and then men and women, women and men. I'm even getting the color coding wrong. All right, so you see support for men among men is lower than among women. That's true essentially everywhere, but here it tops out and we don't think this is a super relevant data point anyways. Okay, what about affirmative action? There we see as you move along the gender equality spectrum, support drops. Men are always less in favor than women. Okay. But the highest support for this policy is actually in the least gender equal countries. I'll come back to why that might be the case at the very end. But this was surprising to us, I can say, before we wrote the paper. I don't think we expected this. All right, now the main contribution is, so these types of measures exist in various data sets, not for this specific policy question, but we've seen this when jobs are scarce, men should be prioritized. This sort of ballpark, very similar. All right, so misperceptions. So here the color coding is blue means overestimating support, red means underestimating support. So for basic rights, the same thing that we found in Saudi Arabia. Well, I didn't mention in Saudi Arabia we ran the experiment. Did I mention that? I didn't mention it. Oh, did I mention it? Okay. Yeah, so, all right, good. So what we did in Saudi Arabia, not just measure the wedge, but actually had the intervention that create behavioral change. The thing we replicate is that this wedge seems to exist in a lot of places, essentially everywhere. So you see in India, for example, great underestimation of support. Here you see in Southeast Asia, a little bit less, but still not in the blue. For affirmative action, you see, again, global divide north-south ballpark. So in the north, there seems to be overestimation of support in the population. In the global south, underestimation. So in the global south, there's general underestimation. You can see this by country. So here the y-axis is misperception. So negative means underestimation. So you see across the world, there's underestimation. There is heterogeneity for sure. Men are more underestimated than women. So men have a very bad reputation for some reason in a lot of these countries. Their support for women having the same rights as men in terms of working outside of the home is much greater than people perceive in every country in the world. But even the support among women is underestimated, but it's much more underestimated for men. For affirmative action, again, the picture is much more nuanced. There's much more heterogeneity. Now, it's true that women are always above men. But you see, there's this space basically to the right of this vertical line where we start to see overestimation of support. And this overestimation comes in terms of overestimating women's demand for these policies or women's attitudes on this policy. For men, it's around 0. So on average, there doesn't seem to be much misperception. Down here, you see underestimation and the greatest underestimation for men. Right. So if we break this down into terciles of gender equality, in the least gender equal countries, there's universal or broad underestimation of support for basic rights, and men are the most underestimated. So support among men is greater than people think in these countries. It's true for basic rights, but it's also true for affirmative action. In the most gender equal countries in the world, in the Scandinavias, in the US, etc., on average, there's overestimation. And this is being driven by an overestimation of what female views are, not by men. So that boils down then to 4 stylized facts. Number 1, support for basic rights for women is universally underestimated. So support is much greater than people think in every country we look at. Men's support for basic rights for women is more underestimated than women's support. So men have a bad reputation, if I can call it that, above and beyond the fact that they are less supportive than women. So it's true, women are more in favor than men, but men are not as anti or against it as people think in these countries, like we found in Saudi Arabia. What about affirmative action? Well, here's more nuance. Support for affirmative action for women is underestimated in low gender equality countries and overestimated in high gender equality countries. And then 4th, men's support for affirmative action for women is more underestimated than women's support in almost all countries. But when we break it down by levels of gender equality, in the low gender equality countries, both men and women's support are underestimated. Both men and women in these low gender equality countries, whether it's India, Turkey, a lot of them, there's greater support than people perceive across both genders. But in the most gender equal countries in the world, the Scandinavias, the US, etc., their women's support is overestimated. And on average, support among men there's no average misperception, it seems. All right, so if you will, I could stop here because the way I motivated the paper was, thinking about the policy toolbox. So now we have moved from finding something in Saudi Arabia where we said, all right, if we detect this wedge, in theory, if you have a theory of change, it's true that monetary incentives matter. It's true that laws matter. It's true that you can potentially change norms, but it's probably much harder to change someone's deep attitude than, for example, just informing others or informing people that, look, people around you are actually quite as progressive as you are. So I think, especially in low gender equality countries, this paper shows you that the scope for these types of intervention is probably much bigger than we thought before. Okay. So I hope that this paper will spur more evidence similar to what we did in Saudi Arabia. We have these kinds of interventions in various domains, not least in the labor market domain, of course. Okay. But you can also start to think about this in other domains, and I'm happy to chat about that afterwards. Now, where do these misperceptions come from? Here, of course, we're going to have to speculate a little bit more. I think if you want to do this super carefully, you might want to run actual additional experiments. We're not running experiments in 60 countries at this point, but I'm going to show you some pretty striking patterns that are consistent with 2 forces seemingly prevalent in almost all of the countries, and in order to try to interpret both the stylized facts and more generally what's going on in terms of what's driving misperceptions. And this is something that I think we had lots of different ideas going into this project of where the misperceptions come from. I mean, on some level, it must mean that people don't talk to each other enough, right? So, which is perhaps, truly sharing their views on matters. So for example, I mean, we studied this a little bit in the Saudi Arabia paper. I've also run kind of for fun surveys when I present work. So I didn't do it here today, but I've done it at like econ departments. So I'll first ask people in the audience through an anonymous online survey to report their own views, and then ask them to report what they think the average support is among colleagues. And basically, all of the departments I've gone to, there's vast misperceptions. So on some level, people at econ departments are not talking to each other enough about their true views. But you can think of various ex ante various phenomena related to, say, mass media or the availability of information, various cognitive biases. Let me start by looking at two countries just to build intuition. And on the x-axis, I'm going to show you the actual support in terms of percent. So 50 here means that, if you're to the right, a majority is in support. But if you're to the left, it means that only a minority is in support. Let's take two countries and two policies. So let's take Zimbabwe, which is in the bottom tercile in terms of gender equality. And then let's take Netherlands, that's at the top. Right. So if we start with Zimbabwe, the support for basic rights for women is, the true support is 80%, but people think it's more like 60% on average. In the Netherlands, the actual support is about a little bit more than 30%, but people think it's closer to 50%. Okay, so what seems to be going on here is that there's a shift. So this is the 45-degree line is when there's no misperception. You can call this the rational expectations equilibrium. We're clearly not in a rational expectations equilibrium. We're in some other kind of equilibrium, right? So there seems to be these shifts, right? So support, when support is below 50%, you see overestimation in the Netherlands. When support is above 50%, you see underestimation. So in both cases, there's overweighting of the minority position. So in Zimbabwe, actually, there's a minority who's against it. There's 20% of the people who's against. So that's, it's sort of a glass half empty, half full. You can say the support is very high. It's 80%. The vast majority is in favor, but there's still 20% of the population that thinks that women should not even have the right to work outside of the home, right? That's kind of a big number in some sense. But in any ways, they're a small minority, right? In Netherlands, the small minority is in favor of affirmative action for women, whereas the majority is against it. Okay, so in both cases, there's overweighting of the minority. So another question is, all right, why could there be minority overweighting? And here again, we're just speculating. So one reason could be that, look, perceptions are just sort of, they're also slow moving. And if reality is changing faster than perceptions, people could have a perception based on outdated views, right? So maybe it's partly influenced by parental generations or whatever, but there's a lag, okay? So then it could be that Zimbabwe used to be more conservative, right? But has moved in the last few years or decades in a more progressive direction, but people don't really, so they have moved on an individual level, but they don't think necessarily that everybody else has moved on, right? We can think the same about Netherlands when it comes to affirmative action. It might be that the support for affirmative action was much greater 10 years ago or 20 years ago when gender inequality in the country was greater, but now, yeah, they have progressed to a higher level of gender equality, and now support at the individual level has waned, but they think other people may not have changed so much, right? Now, mass media could play a big role. In general, we know that mass media is powerful in shaping attitudes, beliefs, etc. There's a long literature on that. There's something interesting about mass media, I think. Jesse Shapiro's made this point in a short paper, which is there's this journalistic tradition in many countries, which is you're supposed to cover an issue, both sides of an issue, right? And it's viewed as sort of a good journalistic tradition. So if it's, if you're talking about, say, should women have the same equal rights as men, sure, you'll bring up people to say, yes, of course. but then you should make sure to also bring up people that say no. Okay, so that's one reason. You could, for example, get equal coverage to both sides, even though the size of the population on each side is not the same. It doesn't have to be that, doesn't have to be equal, but as long as your weight is disproportionate, unless people are able to fully discount for this, they could get the wrong impression based on narrative or stories perpetrated by mass media. More broadly, there could be vocal minorities, not just appearing in mass media, but in general in the public arena, which people use to infer what the norm is in a country, right? So, for example, groups in, let's say, Saudi Arabia, the high religious and conservative might be very vocal in promoting the position of why women should not be allowed to work, all the bad things that happen if you allow women to work, right? You can have, activist groups in Netherlands or the US protesting or showing up on social media, whatever, promoting their position, right? Now, from a collective action perspective, it might be easier if you're a small group to coordinate collective action, first of all. I mean, that's an idea that's in there in the literature for a long time. They might just be more motivated to. They might see, we're in a minority, our values are being threatened, and now we're going to fight to the very bitter end to preserve the values that we believe in. Fourth, there's a documented literature in psychology that deals with these people's various ways by which people have a problem inferring statistical moments. It's often referred to as inattention, conservativeness, or base rate insensitivity, which could lead to this phenomenon of sort of what's called also the central tendency. So all of these reasons, they could be, potentially explain what's going on. But in any ways, there seems to be minority overweighting. How much time do I have? Sorry. 10. Good. All right. So that was 2 countries. Now we can do it for all the countries on both policy issues. So that's plotting that here. So this space here is minority overweighting, and this space here is minority overweighting. So basically, in every country we look at for any given policy, we seem to be in the space of minority overweighting. It's only when we're approximately at 50-50, when there's no clear majority, that people have approximately correct beliefs. Okay, so that's number 1. That seems to be going on. And I think we need to know more about where does this actually come from, right? So Saudi Arabia, for example, was around up here when it came to basic rights. So somewhere in this space. And the intervention we had was to move people's beliefs to the correct. And then we had immediate behavioral change. More women, these wives of these men that we intervened with, they started increasing labor supply, going to job interviews, applying for jobs. We had a second experiment working directly with women with a firm, and where they had a choice between working inside the home or outside of the home, where the outside of the home job was paid a higher rate. And this intervention moved those women to take the job outside of the home. Yeah, but then that's just the overall support in the population. So I haven't gone into the gender specific actual versus perceived. So if we take the 2 examples again with Zimbabwe and the Netherlands, just hypothetically, if the main thing that's driving things was this minority overweighting, well, then we should just see a shift away from the 45-degree line that's parallel. But that's not what we see. What we see is this. So you see a more steep line compared to the 45-degree line for Zimbabwe and the Netherlands, right? So moving on the x-axis, you see the difference in actual support. So in Zimbabwe, there is greater support among women than among men, but the perceived difference is way larger than the actual difference. In Netherlands, we also see a shift to the right. So about 30% for men, about 35% for women. So this is a 5 percentage point gap. But people, they adjust upward for women much more. So they perceive on average about 62% support for women and approximately 35 for men. Is this right? Did I say that right? I think so. Yeah. Okay. So you see this adjustment upward for women and downward for men in these 2 countries. That means that the perceived conflict, if you will, is greater than the actual. And this logic for why this could occur is consistent with stereotyping. So there's a broad literature documenting that we have people engaged in stereotype thinking, or stereotypes exist for lots of groups, not just gender, but also immigrant groups or ethnic groups. And here, this is consistent with that. What's the logic of stereotyping? So Bordalo and Schleifer and co-authors, Kaufman, they have a nice model to formalize this, where basically they formalize the notion of stereotype, which is there's a kernel of truth, but that kernel of truth is being exaggerated. So what's the kernel of truth in this case? Well, it's true that women are more in favor than men. So it's true that men are more against this than women. But in people's head, men are way more against than they actually are, and women are way more in favor than they actually are. This is the logic of stereotyping. Then you could ask the question, why would stereotypes arise? Well, it could be this cognitive phenomenon. That's just how people, there's something going on in the brain. But more broadly, information could be imperfect, right? So even though people process information incorrectly, information itself could be incorrect. And here mass media could play a role. Mass media could emphasize stereotypes. So maybe, for example, the position in favor is always, they always interview a woman, or there's a woman being portrayed. And then if they want to find someone who's against the policy, they find a man, right? So people looking at that in mass media might like overestimate men being against and overestimate women being in favor, for example. That could be one reason. The entertainment industry could perpetuate stereotypes. There's not a lot of evidence in the scientific literature, like hard evidence of that. There's some Bergenian evidence tried to measure stereotypes in mass media, but Elliot Ash and co-authors that finds in the US pretty stark stereotyping of not just gender, but also race in the US. So there's some evidence for this going on already. Another reason for it to arise could be that if you think about politics and political representation, so are we sure that the female politician who's elected actually represent the average of the female population's view versus men, right? If you start deviating from that, perhaps the females that are vocal or in power are not, they're sort of to the right of where females stand, and say males tend to be to the left. And I'm using left right now in the kind of some sort of progressiveness dimension. People may not fully be able to discount that. It's a very complex process, because now you have to have a theory of how the political system works and who gets into power, who doesn't. And that's a very complex process that we economists and political scientists don't even know fully. We're studying this, right? So all of these reasons could be reasons for stereotyping to arise. And if stereotyping arise, we have a pretty clear prediction in terms of what we should see in the data. And this could be exemplified by these shaded areas, which is whatever the overall support in the population, there should be a more than a 45-degree line between what men support and men's perceived support, and women's actual support and perceived support, right? And that will sometimes lead us to be pushing beliefs about women above, and certainly here, beliefs about women can be very, very overestimated, but support among men might be approximately correctly estimated. But it's not because somehow men's views, there's like better information about that men are more open about sharing their views. No, it's just two forms of biases operating in different directions, right? So here at low levels, for men, you see the minority overweighting pushes beliefs up, whereas stereotyping pushes beliefs down. Whereas in these countries like the US and Netherlands and Scandinavia, minority overweighting will push women up, but even further up due to stereotyping. And then you can get vast overestimation. Whereas in the low gender equality countries, say, for men, these two forces operate in the same direction, whereas they operate in opposite directions for women. So what do we see in the data? If we plot all the data for all the countries, we detect this pattern overwhelmingly. So these slopes here are overwhelmingly above 45-degree slope. So there's consistent evidence of gender stereotyping around the world for both policy issues. Okay, so that's a second force or mechanism, if you will, that we find. All right, so now how can we reconcile or interpret these stylized facts, do they help explain the patterns we see across the gender equality spectrum? The answer is yes, they do. So take fact number one, support for basic rights for women is universally underestimated for all countries and both genders. Well, for basic rights, regardless of where we look in the world, in the low gender equality countries or the high, support is very high, right? And because then the minority is very, very small, but people tend to overestimate the minority, it will push beliefs down. And we see that everywhere. Now, what about men's support for basic rights? That's more underestimated than women's support. Well, that goes through with gender stereotyping, pushing beliefs down for men. What about affirmative action? Support for affirmative action for women is underestimated in low gender equality countries and overestimated in high gender equality countries, right? So think here are the black dots. Well, in the high gender equality countries, there's a minority in support, and that will tend to push it up. Whereas here, the majority is in support, and that will tend to push beliefs down. But in countries like India, etc., the minority is against. So you get this underestimation. And finally, for the fourth fact, we see this very heterogeneous pattern that in the high income countries, the high gender equality countries rather, we see overestimation of women primarily. There seems to be, again, a combination of the minority bias and the stereotyping operating in the same direction. Whereas in low gender equality countries, men have a very bad reputation because the minority bias pushes them down and gender stereotyping pushes them down. Okay. So just to recap, through this paper, we have documented significant misperceptions around the world in very different policy contexts, both affirmative action and basic rights for women, and across the gender equality spectrum, right? Even sort of low gender equality to high gender equality. So there's scope for policy interventions. And there are two forces that seems to be driving this: minority overweighting and gender stereotyping. And there seems to be less conflict between the genders in terms of support for these kind of policies than people perceive. And in some sense, that's good news, that men and women are more aligned than a lot of people think. Let me just say one final word. The paper is not primarily about these first order beliefs, but what's striking is that I think that a lot of men, especially in low income countries, are in support of these policies that at a first blush they could potentially be the losers of these policies, right? Especially at leadership positions. There's an interesting new paper by Oriana Bandera, Nava Ashraf, and co-authors using very nice data from a multinational company from about 100 countries with the same task, documented the productivity of women versus men. That seems to suggest there's strong misallocation. So at the margin, women are more productive than men. So replacing the marginal men with a marginal female would increase productivity. It might be that a lot of men has realized that there's a lot of mediocre men out there that could be replaced, that will increase the overall efficiency of the economy. And maybe they don't think they are the mediocre men, but they think others will be pushed out. Because firms will tend, the first people they will push out is, of course, the mediocre men, right? But maybe these men think that doesn't apply to them. I don't know, it's just speculation. All right, I'll end there. Thank you.